All right, thank you so much. So we are halfway through the presentations. Hope you all had a chance to stretch your legs. So if I do say so myself, this next group is pretty special. And that's because it's my group. And they will be presenting on behalf of their client, the Coral Restoration Foundation. I'd like to introduce Aditi.
Can you guys hear me okay? Yeah, you can hear that. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to join us tonight. I'm excited to discuss the capstone project that my team and I have been working on this semester. Our project is about empowering climate resilience in South Florida through coral restoration education. And our client is the Coral Restoration Foundation, who I will be referring to as CRF for the remainder of the presentation. Before we dive further, here is a quick view of our team. A special shout out to our faculty advisor, Chandler, and CRF for being great partners this semester. So let's meet CRF. CRF is a marine conservation nonprofit based in the Florida Keys. They also happen to manage the world's largest reef restoration program. Their core missions involve restoring coral reefs, educating others on the importance of oceans, and further coral research. And their work in the Florida Keys is especially important considering that the Florida Keys Reef Tract is the third largest reef system in the world, spanning at about 360 linear miles. The reef provides local benefits such as supporting biodiverse marine systems and providing shoreline protection. It also supports economically 70,000 jobs and generates about $4 billion in local sales each year. Unfortunately, a lot of these benefits are under threat due to increased stressors on the reef. This includes overfishing, pollution, rising sea levels, rising sea surface temperatures, which leads to coral bleaching and disease, ocean acidification, which stunts coral growth, and hurricane intensification, which erodes the buffer that coral reefs offer. This here is a snapshot of coral coverage in the Florida Reef Tract in Monroe County. Highlighted in yellow is Monroe County, which sits at the southernmost tip of Florida. 99% of Monroe County lives in the islands of the Florida Keys, and the rest live in Everglades National Park, which is that rectangular shape up there. And the orange dots represent coral coverage. So now that we have a bit of background on CRF, the Florida Reef Tract, and corals, these are the three asks that CRF posed to us at the onset of our project. First, CRF wants to know, how are South Florida Title I students impacted by climate change? 2, how does coral restoration impact Title I students? And 3, how are the impacts of environmental education on students and families measured? And for everybody's understanding, Title I applies to schools in which children from low-income families make up 40% of enrollment. CRF wanted us to focus on Title I students for potential grant and funding opportunities and to increase equitable access to education. Now to speak a bit to our strategy and how we approach CRF's asks. So we researched CRF's backgrounds and the problem statements, and through aligning with them on our deliverables, we actually felt it was necessary to expand upon their initial problem statements. We restructured the asks into 3 high-level areas. 1 is looking at the impacts of climate change and restoration on Monroe County. 2 is measuring the impact of environmental education on Title I students and families. And 3 is to develop criteria to gauge the efficacy of CRF's educational programs. This then led us to our final recommendations. So the first point, let's get to know Monroe County a bit. Monroe County has 75,000 residents with a median household income of $72,000. There's a 10.3% poverty rate, which is below the national average. But when it's compared against the basic cost of living in Monroe County, 29% of households are living below the county's thresholds. This is a big tourist destination, and the top employment industries reflect just that. And in terms of the environment, Monroe County sits at less than 10 feet above sea level, making it extra vulnerable to sea level rise, intense storm events. There's also water quality issues as a result of water treatment challenges coming from northern Florida. So throughout our research, we know that Monroe County's economy is heavily related to the area's environmental richness and appeal, and that marine health is also linked closely to the health of coral reefs. With that, we wanted to estimate the value of coral coverage in relation to a few economic indicators such as leisure spending, tax remittance, and commercial fishing. Based on our calculations, total coral coverage in Monroe County is about the size of Manhattan at 24 square miles. And while that may seem like a lot, that actually only reflects 3% of coral coverage, which is down from 40% in the 1970s. But even with the coral coverage, the size of Manhattan, and declining year over year, we can still see how dependent Monroe County is on corals for their economic success and stability. And this also shows the importance of CRS programming in increasing coral coverage now and in the future. We also mapped out who the community stakeholders would be in relation to CRF, and the goal of this was to assess the impact of CRS restoration efforts on the local community and to see if it really percolates on a grassroots level. We identified K through 12 students, dive shops, and fisheries as the primary stakeholders. And we identified a few insights, but just to speak to two, we saw that one, coral reef health definitely impacts tourism. And two, we also saw that there are challenges in regulating recreational fishing compared to commercial fishing. And this is because commercial fisheries are mandated to reef protection rules more than recreational fishers. So there's definitely a gap there. Another key component of this project was understanding the link between CRF, environmental education, and the impact on students in the Monroe County school system that are receiving free or reduced lunch, FRL, and Title I funding. In Monroe County, just 5 schools qualify for Title I funding. And this is interesting because despite Monroe County's median household income of $72,000, 40% of Monroe County students reside in households that earn no more than $23,000 per year. This massive wealth gap in Monroe County households means that lower income students, which are majority Black, Indigenous, Hispanic, multiracial, are at higher risk of failing to meet state academic standards in math, reading, writing, and more. So now that you have the background on Monroe County, let's talk a little bit about environmental education. According to a 2017 Stanford study, environmental education led to improvements in environmental behaviors, academic performance, personal growth and life building, feelings of empowerment, critical thinking and problem solving, and civic engagement. And this also happens to be a huge focus of CRF's efforts. CRF has the goal to educate students about corals and the importance of oceans in order for them to become lifelong ocean stewards. CRF does this through the 6 educational programs listed here: dive programs, internships, general presentations, K through 12 activity packs, edutainment, and after-school programs. And so CRF wanted us to develop criteria to gauge the efficacy of these 6 educational programs. We conducted a gap analysis based on criteria from the North American Association for Environmental Education and the National Environmental Education Advancement Project. The criteria that we benchmarked against are listed here. The first is engagement, which is looking at things like retention rate, active discussion and participation. The second, science and misconceptions, looking at science accessibility, whether or not the content was actually really rooted in science and addresses misconceptions. And the third is community impact. So looking if there was a real cultivation of stewardship and a positive contribution to conservation. And these were our results. We did a gap analysis for all 6 programs, but for the purpose of this presentation, we're just showing these 3 here. We also developed surveys for students to take before and after they engage in CRF's programming. And we base it on these 4 points here. So the first is education. Do students understand threats to coral reefs? Do they understand how they can engage in conservation efforts? Engagement, are students excited to learn about coral reefs? 3, emergence. Are students interested and willing to share what they've learned? And the last is enrollment. Are students likely to continue their participation in CRS programming in the future? We piloted our surveys with 51 students in Title I schools across 3 different presentation sections. We use SurveyMonkey QR codes to distribute these surveys. And fun fact, this QR code is actually live. So if you're interested in scanning it to see what was in the survey, go ahead. And we also put together a draft implementation guide for CRF interns to use. And this is just to ensure the long-term viability and scalability of these surveys. And looking at the results from our survey pilot, we saw a 102% improvement in student education, a 25% improvement in student enthusiasm and engagement, a 32% improvement in student interest in volunteering with CRF, And while we are missing start of program pre-survey data for the emergence point, 80% of students expressed a willingness to share what they've learned with family and friends after participating in this presentation, which I find kind of remarkable to see how staggering these stats are. And so taking you through all of this, we've come away from this project with 3 key recommendations for our client that will help them improve their engagement, benchmarking, and program metrics, which we dive further into in our actual report and our presentation for the client. But it's important for us to convey how CRF will actually benefit and implement these deliverables. So the first is that we intend CRF to foster strategic partnerships with community stakeholders, meaning whether it's through working with recreational fishermen or having boat rentals and dive shops educate tourists, these sorts of collaborative and strategic partnerships may actually, increase the effectiveness of CRS restoration efforts. 2 is leveraging the research that we put together to support their fundraising efforts, whether it's through seeking private funding or leveraging state grant funding opportunities. The 3rd is defining short-term and long-term impact targets for each educational program and consistently benchmarking against these. And the last is to analyze survey data on a consistent basis to identify areas for improvement. So with that, I'll conclude my presentation and open up for questions. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. Oh, was that loud? Sorry. So I just wanted to ask if you could go back to your slide with the KPIs and the gap analysis. So I was just wondering if you could go into a little bit more detail as to like how you actually quantified, for example, community impact, like what makes it 67%? Like, were they like binary, like 1s, 0s, or was it like more detailed breakdown? I was just interested in how you quantified.
Yeah, we were looking at them kind of on, and to be super clear, there were definitely certain gaps in us even figuring out what sort of, I guess, research we would use to do this gap analysis. And this also provided an opportunity for CRF to flesh out how they actually capture data going forwards. But yeah, we kind of did it on a basis of ranking them from kind of like a 1 to 10 scale, where we would then benchmark each program against these different factors. So that's a little bit of how we did that.
I don't think that this, now it's working. Great job. When you guys discussed your education programs and everything in your recommendations, did you talk about, or did you guys come across funding those through almost like a tourist tax, something small, 1 or 2% of the $3 billion of revenue?
Are you talking about this here?
Yes, off of leisure spending, I guess.
Yeah, so leisure spending actually does incorporate tourist tax as well. It's the reason why this number is so large is because it really includes things like, diving programs, other sorts of just basic sorts of like tourism industries that is involved in Monroe County. So that does include the tourist tax. Does that answer your question or?
Yeah, I mean, I was saying to use a tourist tax to fund your projects and your recommendations.
That's definitely really interesting. That wasn't part of the scope of our project, but CRF is a privately funded nonprofit. So they're able to fund all of their programs through private donors. But kind of a recommendation coming out of this and the intent with being able to tap into more programs for Title I students, there is a possibility of being able to take tourist tax and other sorts of public sources of funding to increase access and just like general funding for those programs.
Got it. Thanks.
Okay, well, if there's no other questions, thank you so much for taking time to listen today.